Hey, it's Sean from the Commander's Brew. This episode is about Farid enterprising Salvager. Farid makes scrap, and that seems incredibly useful in many commander decks. I'm going to talk about some cards that would be crucial if you want to make a Farid deck, but I'm also going to talk about decks that would really want Farid in the 99 and how to utilize that synergy. Bit of a potpourri episode, if you will. I'm using the scraps of other decks. See what I did there? Scraps. All the cards I'm going to talk about are in a link below if you're interested. And towards the end I talk about a brew that I had to cut short because I think I want to do a full episode on it. It seems really deep. I'm not going to give you a deck. I'm going to teach you today. But anyway, before we get to that, I have to do a little bit of business, and I will make this quick, I promise. This holiday season, give someone you care about the gift of freedom, financial freedom, by investing in Phyrexian digital coins. Introducing the Norn Coin, digital online currency inspired by Erlash Norn themselves. You've heard of the blockchain. Well, we are backed by the secure nature of the Phyrexian food chain, where Phyrexian organisms are judged by their ability to survive nightmarish worlds. You'll only get the successful ones that evolve with an unspeakable mixture of necrotic tissue and greasy metal. And we offer complete transparency if you put it in a glass box or something else see-through. And we promise, it's not going to make our stuff +2/+2 and your stuff worth -2/-2. Trust us. Norncoin, a division of Darksteel Industries. And now the Relight by the Wizard's Tower. WizardTower.com. Not only is that a great website to get articles on Commander and other Magic formats, it's a great place to buy singles too. And if you're in Canada, you can use coupon code BREWBROTHERS to get 5% off. The Wizard's Tower does not accept Norncoin. Nobody accepts Norncoin. Now back to the show. Farid makes scrap, and that's really all we need from them. The rest is just bonus. So Farid makes scrap, and that's really all we need from them. The rest is pure bonus. Even if it does seem overcosted to spend 2 mana to gain a counter or do some discard draw stuff, that's fine. Keeping one enemy creature goaded indefinitely does seem like a nice option to have, but it does cost you 2 mana as like a subscription fee just to have that feature. I mean, I like having it, but I don't plan on using it for that much. Bit pricey. But the scrap's where it's at. It's really just a shame that there's no token for it, at least not one that I could find. Now we've got to get artifacts into the graveyard from the battlefield. The easiest and cheapest way to me seems like artifacts that sacrifice themselves to do things. Luckily, there's tons of artifacts that sack themselves that are already basically format staples, depending on your meta. Mindstone, a classic. If it's that key spot of a 2 mana rock, so we can play it on 2 and go up to 4 for the following turn. Commander's Sphere might have fallen a bit out of favor since when it first debuted, but it's still a solid card. Hedron Archive going a bit further up the chain. All of these are good mana rocks that when we're done with it, when we don't need the mana anymore, we can just sacrifice them, turn them into some card draw, and get a piece of scrap to go along with it. And something like Tormod's Crypt, which comes down for free and sacks to make us scrap for free if that's of interest to us. Soulguide Lantern does cost a little bit more, but both of these cards are good ways to deal with enemy graveyards. And Glittering Stockpile is a card I'm interested in. I'll admit I've never gotten into my opening hand yet, so I've not been able to cast it early and really put a bunch of counters on it. So, I mean, maybe that's why it's not really popular because of how hard it is to get to work, but it does seem like it has a ton of potential. I haven't given up on you, Stockpile. Now I want to look at some cards that work well in general in an artifact strategy. Whether it's Farid's deck or if Farid's just in the 99, I think these are worth considering. Some of these cards do care what kinds of cards are in your deck. Inspiring Statuary in particular does care about non-artifact spells. This doesn't really do a lot if you have actual 0 non-artifact spells in your deck. But even if Farid's your commander or someone else like Farid, I like a card like this because it is a 3 mana rock that helps you pay back your commander tax. Presumably, there'll always be that one non-artifact spell in your command zone. And then for Farid, something like Slagstone Refinery seems awesome. I mean, it should synergize well, it came from the same set, but in particular, it's focused on the non-token artifacts going into the graveyard. We get a scrap and a Power Stone token with these two out. Mystic Forge is another card that is always going to be good in a deck with a ton of artifacts because we get to play from the top of the library sometimes. And if we're talking non-artifacts dying, that also means permanents going to the graveyard, so then we gotta talk Aetherworks Marvel. I am a sucker for this card, even if I'm not generating energy any other way. If I've got a great pipeline to get a bunch of things going into the graveyard, permanents that is, this thing gets a lot of spins for free. And then of course Gear Up or Ether Grid. We definitely want a lot of non-tokens, and we'll probably be making tokens with other methods as well, so this ends up being a lot of ping damage. And then as a bonus, I'm going to throw in Mindslaver here as another artifact that can sacrifice itself to make us a scrap. And if your opponents give you a hard time because they don't like being Mindslavered, just tell them that's not why you're doing it. You just need the scrap. I don't want to take your turn. I just have to for my game. I'm going to assume we want to generate as much scrap as possible. Anything we can do repeatedly to make scrap will be a premium. Here's some cards that work nicely as scrap generators. Goblin Engineer lets us swap an artifact on the battlefield for one in the graveyard as long as it costs 3 or less. And if you're reading between the lines, that's also a scrap. Goblin Welder is the same thing, only this one has no restriction on what we get to bring back, as long as it's an artifact. And it's also over $10. And then someone like Doretti Scrap Savant, who could also be the commander and have Farid in the 99, is another way to get cards in and out of the graveyard. Artifacts specifically, that's more scrap. And maybe if we're looking at the 99 for Farid, we run him in something like Osgir the Reconstructor. Osgir helps us put artifacts in the graveyard from the battlefield. Non-token ones, because we want them in the graveyard so that we can exile them to make 2 token copies of them. And Farid would bring along a piece of scrap, which we could do to sacrifice just to get a little power boost if we needed it. And if we're doing some sort of red-white shell, we might as well run Wake the Past. Just seems like a strong card. And that does seem like a pretty interesting list for a red-white color pairing. I could see an Osgir deck coming together in a pretty fun way. So now let's get to some other commanders that would really like having some extra scrap lying around. They'll need to want to run non-token artifacts or care about having extra artifacts lying around. Mishra Eminent One is a pretty neat contender. We'll be happy to turn all those little scraps into 4/4 constructs that get to attack. I probably don't care that I have to sacrifice it because it's just a piece of scrap anyway, right? Breya Ethereum Shaper has always been a powerful commander, but whenever I run a Breya deck, I'm always thinking about having those extra artifacts to sacrifice. That's often the troubling part of the deck. So Farid just helps us get in the scrap business so that we can keep activating these abilities. I think Jansen is an interesting one too. Sack a scrap, make 2 constructs, sack a construct, make 2 treasures, sack a non-token artifact, make a scrap. And a Saheeli the Gifted deck often wants a lot of artifacts lying around because of that +1 that lets us cast spells to cost less for each artifact you control as you cast it. Now these scraps function as ramp, sort of. If we do plan on making a bunch of tokens with Farid, I gotta mention Brutaclad. Man, I'm obsessed with this card. There might be a little bit of tension here because with Farid we do want non-token artifacts dying, and a Brutaclad deck doesn't have a ton of room for effects like that. But maybe a Galazeth Prismari deck does. Any Galazeth runs a bunch of little artifacts that draw a card when they enter and then become mana rocks. And then if those little non-token artifacts end up going to the graveyard, Farid would make a scrap out of them, which is also another mana rock. Now that is true ramp for it. And so far maybe my favorite contender for a commander to put Farid in. I want to take a few seconds and dig a little bit deeper into Jansen. This would be a Mardu brew. I ended up here because I was looking for artifacts that were able to sacrifice themselves. See, that's why I love doing an exercise like this. I've got so many new deck ideas I want to try. Luckily, they only release new commanders one every couple of months, so we're not flooded with them, right? I want to go back to Jansen for a second. So this little package is all about this first artifact here. Tainted Sigil. This obviously came up because I was looking for artifacts that sacrifice themselves so that Farid could make a scrap. But being able to gain that much life, there's just so much potential here. If this is the kind of deck we're going with, we'll definitely want to have Marionette Master as well. Our opponents are losing a ton of life, which turns that sigil into a massive amount of life gain for us. Reckless Fireweaver is another way we're pinging our opponents every time more artifacts come into play, token or non-token. And pair that with something like Veto Thorn of the Dusk Rose. That's gotta be game, right? If everyone's lost 15, that means we'll gain a total of 45, and that means everyone else will then lose another 45. Imagine if you had some way to loop the Tainted Sigil back out of the graveyard to keep doing it over and over. Even if you've only gained a couple of life to begin with, this thing gets out of control. Note to self, don't forget about this deck plan either. I also did some digging looking for legendary creatures that made artifact tokens. If it's good for them, it'll probably be good with Farid too. I ended up in the Stranger Things, or the Friends Forever if you prefer calling them that. Whatever world you want to live in your Magic. The best thing about this little crew is that you could really go with whatever colors you wanted to fill out the rest of the deck any way you like. I think I'd want to start with Warnog Rider's Chaplain. It's a nice solid little way to put it a few artifacts at a time. I'm assuming because Farid's going to go in this deck, we will want a lot of artifact tokens. And if we're adding red, I might consider Sophina, Spear Sage Deserter. Non-token attacking creatures let us investigate, which again is potential to make creature tokens in one combat step. And if we're looking at Friends Forever, we might as well look at partners as well. There's some really interesting options here. We've got options for what colors we want to add to red, as well as what particular playstyle we want to go with. And it should go without saying that if we're going to start assuming Farid is in the 99, we'll need to make sure we've got red. So Toggo Goblin Weaponsmith also makes little trinkety artifact tokens. These ones have actual use besides the scrap, but They also come in a little bit easier. Well, different. It's easier to get landfall triggers, but we really have a hard time getting more than one per turn with Toggo. Whereas with Farid, we can get a ton of scrap in one turn if we get enough non-token artifacts to die. Pros and cons, I suppose. And we might want to consider partnering with Glacian, Power Stone Engineer. All that extra scrap lying around leads to pretty big X's to look through a lot of cards. Nice for combos. I'm already thinking about a red-white Brew, and maybe Akiri Lineslinger is important for that. Akiri can have some serious power on the battlefield. Major Voltron vibes here. Dargo the Shipwrecker is another card that cares about sacrificing things, like scrap tokens. 7 mana is a very hefty cost on a commander, but if we can keep making enough scrap, we should be able to cast Dargo for almost 1 mana every time. And another beefy commander is Brynelin the Moonkraken. If we were to partner these two together, and we're doing our thing with Farid and maybe some other ways, we should be able to cast Dargo for 1 red mana very often, which does trigger Brynelin the Moonkraken's ability to return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. This does seem like a cute thing we could do, but that's a lot of hoops to jump through just to put one thing back in their owner's hand. I can't imagine we'll be doing that too often. And Kodama of the East Tree is another potential partner that we would want Farid in the 99 of. Whenever Farid makes a scrap, that is a permanent with mana value 0, so we're allowed to put another permanent down that has mana value 0. Guess what? That's lands. That's really powerful. Kodama seems like a front runner here. Kodama seems very strong with Farid as a backup. Farid makes scrap, Kodama gets to play out a 0-drop, aka a land. And of course, Toggo's a natural partner to go with Kodama. Toggo and Farid overlap a ton, but I also want access to blue. So this means that we've got exactly 2 options to start with Kodama and make a Temur deck with red and blue in it as well. We've got Crown, Ludovic's Opus, a little bit pricier, but we have a strong potential to draw extra cards every turn cycle. And maybe pricey is not a bad thing, because if we've got Kodama, we'll probably be putting a ton of lands down. Ludovic Necro Alchemist is the other way to go to get a Temur commander set up in our partnership. And depending how greedy your meta is for drawing extra cards, this could be a pretty powerful effect. It might steer away a lot of attackers. Who knows? But the main reason I want blue along with Farid, along with Kodama, is for something like Tatyova Benthic Druid. This is what it's all about. I want to make a scrap, or a rock, because Toggo's probably in the 99 too. That triggers Kodama's thing that lets us put a 0 mana value thing down, which is going to be a land, which triggers Tatyova, which lets us draw another card. That's how we're going to keep our hand full of lands so that we can keep triggering this thing and keep putting lands down. AEC Tyrant of Gyre Strait is a more expensive, less powerful Tatyova, but I definitely want redundancy on this effect. And then we probably got to put in the Tireless Pairs, the Tireless Provisioner, and the Tireless Tracker to get extra tokens on the battlefield, which means extra land drops, which means extra tokens. So this whole thing just gets out of control really quick. I mean, I don't even want to consider how crazy we'll get with ramp if we run something like Bootlegger's Stash as well. Then the lands themselves that we put down get to tap to make a treasure token, which is another piece of scrap on the battlefield. Not literally. Treasure tokens are way better than scrap. They're treasure after all. Wow, I kind of feel like I'm just getting started here. I think I'm going to have to wrap up the episode here. I am way too into that Kodama Crown Temur brew to just touch on it in one chapter of this episode. I think I need to go deeper and do a full episode on this. Maybe just for my own sake. Would you want to see an episode like that? Let me know in the comments. And I do appreciate you watching this far. If you've enjoyed it, a like and a subscribe would go a really long way. It helps get this channel in front of some new eyes. Comments do the same thing. And the most impactful way to support, if you're interested in doing that, is through patreon.com/commandersbrew. And that link below that has all the cards that I talked about in this episode, anything you purchase through there gives me a little kickback too, even if it's not cards from this episode. And until next time, you keep being you. World's a better place for it. See you next time. Oh, and if you like a bunch of rocks, check out this other Toggo list I did. This one's with Glacian. I called it Time Traveling Rocks. It's got extra turns in it though, so be warned.